The second panel of the day is, I'm sorry, I didn't bring my reading glasses, so if I make a mistake, forgive me. So I'm going to do like this. Okay, the title of the panel is Legal Interconnections, and we were supposed to have 3 speakers today. Unfortunately, Professor Randi Deguilhem fell sick and basically did not make it. And we wish her Godspeed, but she's not going to be making it today. However, we've been running out of time, so we're not giving you extra time. Sorry about that, okay? So we have 2 speakers rather than 3, but I'm sure Professor Abou-El-Haj is going to make up for any lost time. We begin with Professor Rifa'at Abou-El-Haj, who was from Binghamton University, and the title of his talk is Development of the Jury System in 16th Century Ottoman Jerusalem. I told him earlier that he whetted our appetites by talking about the possibility of a jury system in the Ottoman Empire, and so we are eager to hear and listen.
Masa al-khair, good afternoon, everybody. I'm surprised I'm the first to speak, but I guess there's a speaker before me who wasn't here. Anyway, I basically don't like to lecture. Therefore, you're going to have to put up with somebody who has to read a text for you. It may be boring, but I hope the discussion will make it more interesting. I prefaced my talk with a couple of paragraphs that are, in a way, a kind of disclaimer to this conference. As I say, I wish to preface my presentation by stating the following disclaimer. That I studied the Ottoman past as a historian. No more, no less. I don't claim to be an expert on Islam. I don't claim to be an expert on basically anything else but Ottoman history, and really, if you pin down my publications and my work, seriously, I've worked maybe in main Ottoman history for about 30 years of that history, mainly late 17th, early part of the 18th. And today's presentation is really from provincial history, but I recognize it's provincial Ottoman history. In other words, I don't consider it Arab history. I don't think there was such a thing as Arab history in the 16th century. So as I said, take me seriously when I say I'm really only concerned with being a historian. I'm not really interested in being identified in any other way. I do not claim to have any expertise on Islam, and therefore cannot present you with that orientation. As for example, trying to understand the historical phenomenon as Hudson of University of Chicago, in his invention actually of a formula to try to understand the history called Islamic age. To this day, I don't know what that means. It doesn't really generate any meaning for me, the term. But obviously it's a formula that was invented for a Western audience to understand basically an alien culture called Islam, and Islamic age is invention to get a clue. And it continued, and I think it's the paradigm shift now to try to understand Islamic history in less formulaic way. This is, anyway, my hope. And the other example of the same kind of interpretation is a work of somebody who specializes on the Sharia. His name is Abou-El-Haj, who teaches now at Columbia, and he used to be in Canada. And his work there is to use basically the method and understanding of the Sharia to evaluate the nation state. What is the nation state? And in a way, he's looking at the Sharia as a way of saying it doesn't fit into the history of Muslim society. I mean, to me, it's a nonsensical way of trying to understand the historical phenomenon. The nation state is a European invention, 17th, 18th century mainly, started in America as an example, and then went to France, and so on. It has a historical context and has to be understood historically, no matter what culture is looking at it or what culture adopts it. So I can't relate to understanding the nation state through Sharia. And this is basically the methodology that Abou-El-Haj has been trained in, and he's an Islamist, and he teaches Islam. Another point of disagreement, and some of you might find this uncomfortable, in my use of comparative history, and some of you have heard different approaches already today, I have tried consistently and consciously to avoid comparisons of forms. In other words, there's an English form, like in the case of the kafala that I'm trying to use here, with the English form of legal form for local government. In the case of, and some of you have worked on Ottoman political culture and have read works on Ottoman political culture. Several works have been published. Most recently, a book by Heather Ferguson comparing Ottoman to Habsburg. Political forms. I'm trying to make a distinction between this approach, which is to look at forms, the Austrian, the Habsburg form, and the Ottoman form. As a historian, that doesn't make any sense for me. I don't understand how forms can be compared, because a form, and some of the discussion today actually reminded me of this disparity. A form, to me, a historical form, is a product of a social process. All right? In other words, if you're talking about a living society, then you have to start with that premise. Then whatever forms there are at any particular point have to be understood as a creation of that moment, irrespective of whether there are precedents for it in the 2nd century or 7th century or the 10th century. If you're talking about the 16th century, in the case of my case today, or in where I've focused most of my attention in Ottoman history on the period, the so-called period of decline, I focused on the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, and this might be a good occasion to re-raise the question that we had in the discussion this morning, in terms basically of how do you locate the social processes that creates a particular form, whatever it is. If it is historical, it's not God-made, it's man-made. Therefore, we have to try to explain it and understand it as a human expression. Even as some of you, in the work that you presented today, really see it as Islamic, as something coming from Muslim forms. That doesn't mean anything to me. As a historian, I see whatever forms we deal with as creations, human creations, and if there are precedents for it. I don't take guidance from the past to understand, for example, the 17th and 18th century. Some of you, I think, you used the Nasihatname, the political culture of the Ottomans, to try to explain the phenomenon. And to me, the Nasihatname goes back to the 16th century, 17th century. I can't understand the Nasihatname of the 17th and 18th century in terms of their origins. I mean, let alone the convivencia, going back to the convivencia to try to explain 16th, 17th, 18th century use of convivencia, which you didn't. I mean, you tried to address convivencia in terms of the conversos. They were the Muslim converts in this case. And you situated their understanding in their time. You didn't try to say, I have to explain it theologically as a Muslim thing. Again, ahistorical treatment. You just actually situated this historical moment in the moment that these people were writing, expressing themselves. So the meaning is not derived from the form. The meaning is derived from the use of that form at a particular moment, which means it's a recreation. And that therefore, you can't really understand the 17th century and 18th century phenomenon, even though there are forms that preceded it that a lot of people actually try. And to me, it's ahistorical. It's almost anti-historical to try to explain a phenomenon of the 17th or early part of the 18th century by going to the 16th and even early 17th. In today's presentation, I want to give you a little background about how I came to do this kind of research, because the research that this presentation I'm making is really a breakaway from my history, my intellectual history, my scientific history. As I said before, most of my research and writing and articles have been on the so-called period of decline, and what I think I proved that there was no decline in this late 17th century. In fact, there was a renewal. And that renewal, interestingly enough, many Western scholars, some of my own teachers, have discovered. And something, it's related to the question I raised also earlier, why are you specializing in these studies you're doing? You group. What is the motive for choosing that? Or for a Turk to be a specialist in Ottoman history? I ask that of everybody. Based on the idea that if you're going to commit yourself to a life and a career, you should relate to it. Somehow, it should relate to you somewhat biographically, preferably. And in your presentation, I was thinking, maybe you'd say, I am Hispanic. No, I'm just making an example here, okay? And that will be the first question that comes to me. How would, this person writing about this, the convivencia, and if she's not Hispanic, what is the relationship? And these are the questions I ask because these are the legitimate questions to ask. In other words, what is the motivation for all of us to commit our lives to study, to a good number of you, really alien societies, alien cultures, alien even belief systems. And you are devoting, remember, a life career to it. If you're not really convinced inside of yourself that there's relevance to your work, to you, even if you're doing Ottoman history and you're Hungarian, okay, what is the relationship between you, Gabor, doing Ottoman history, and you're Hungarian, right? I mean, you're not Ottoman, you're not Muslim, and I'm asking you that question to think about, because I have to situate you. No matter what you say, I'm not saying I'm right, but I think as a historian, I have to do that to really take you seriously.
Rifa'at, you have 10 minutes.
About a commitment here. We're not talking about, flipping a coin and deciding you're going to spend 30 years of your life.
You have 10 minutes.
You have 1 minute?
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So the burden is on you now.
Yes.
Explain the presentation, okay? I'm going to start.
I want to hear about jury.
The first paragraph, skipping the first paragraph of my paper, and read a couple of pages. Just read it introducing, because you've read the whole paper, so you can sum. The wider framework within which the study is conducted includes the space. The wider framework within which the study is conducted includes the space that separates society from the state. In early modern times, you were talking about Jerusalem in the 16th century, Ottoman Jerusalem, also in early Ottoman rule. We're not talking about 17th, 18th, we're really early Ottoman rule. And focuses on how individuals carried on their day-to-day lives at the local level, attending to their own affairs and interaction to the exclusion of, or near exclusion of the state and its officials. I say near because there are some officials, but the officials are really tangential. And we're talking about local affairs, and what I'm proposing is that there's an autonomy, there's self-rule, even under this absolutist state that all of us Ottomanists assume about the Ottoman state. The primary premise of this paper is that there existed considerable autonomy of the local society from the state. This in direct contrast to the diminishing space between the modern state, all of us belonging to some nation state, modern state, and modern society, that the state and society today are really much more integrated than 16th century, I don't know, 15th or 13th. What have you. The evidence for the study is sought in the system of surety, or kafala, in Jerusalem in the 16th century, in which the kafil, the bondsman, extended warranty for good behavior of groups of local residents in the conduct of their day-to-day life, which incorporated their public and private behavior. It is proposed here that in the process of delineating the kafala, this surety system, a glimpse can be captured of the lives of inhabitants in quarters, the way the old city of Jerusalem was divided, communities and neighborhoods of the 16th century. The term kafala is a metaphor, after all, with varying historical meanings. For purposes of this study, an attempt is made to differentiate between the ad hoc practice of kafala, or surety, as it is to this day, incidentally, because I lived in Jerusalem in the middle of the last century, and I experienced kafala myself. The quarters of the city of Jerusalem was divided into quarters, and each quarter had a headman. He called himself a sheriff in English, but he's called anyway. A bondman extended warranty for the good behavior of groups of local residents in the conduct of their day-to-day life, which incorporated their public and social behavior. It is proposed here that in the process of delineating the kafala system, a glimpse can be captured of the lives of inhabitants in the quarters, mahallat, if you like, communities and neighborhoods of 16th century Jerusalem. Now, a couple of days ago, it hit me that there's another dimension of the work that I'm presenting, which I didn't emphasize, but I think it's coming to me now. It's basically, I was looking at a form of governance. So it is not just simply a matter of a kafil giving warranty of good behavior, but that this is really a system of governance that the Ottomans adopted and adapted, and of course evolved under the Ottomans. So my newest insight from work I did about 10 years ago, on which this paper is based, is that at the lowest level of governance, the invention of governance, the system of governance, was a local one. It wasn't an Ottoman one from Istanbul. It was maybe something that was inherited from Mamluks. A lot of people do that. I'm not too convinced because of the work of others who've done that. I'm not too convinced. Like Amnon Cohen had done some work on this, an Israeli scholar who specializes in Palestinian Ottoman history, or Bernard Lewis, who also, to me, is...
2 minutes.
What?
2 minutes.
What?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. The term kafala is a metaphor with varying historical meanings. The purpose for this study, an attempt is made to differentiate between the ad hoc practice of kafala, or surety, as it is or has been undertaken in the scholarly literature, and to contrast it to the one proposed here, a social system with political implications. In its more limited but generic sense, the term refers to a mechanism that facilitated mostly individual civil and commercial transactions whereby surety or bonds were offered on behalf of individuals in commercial transactions. In the more generic use of the term, an individual, for example, had a bond placed with a bondman as a guarantee for adherence to or rendition of a specific and simple task, which were mostly of commercial nature, like a debt or borrowing, but sometimes of a civil nature. A bond also, a kafir, could be set up to vouch for the good behavior, a good conduct of a person at any one time, for a specific period of time. This application of the kafala was limited in its application or scope and coverage in a social range at a certain point in history. in the way that kafala is studied here, expands the social and spatial reach of the metaphor to illuminate a system that provided surety on behalf of large groups, not individuals now, expanding from the individual to large groups of individuals, all at once, and continuously renewed a bond that vouched for the good behavior of these groups, yet known mostly as named individuals within these groups against their infraction of public order. Initially, the bond guaranteed the behavior of residents of whole quarters, but later it was limited to spatially limited space of the neighborhoods of the named individuals within these quarters. Thus, the range of the application of the system reached to inwards as it progressed, penetrated even into the private life of individual members of households and directly into their homes. And I'll stop there. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks to the organizers, especially Suhaira Siddiqui, for the invitation, and also for other organizers for having me. So, in the presentation, I'll stick to 16th century. We slightly move away from Jerusalem to a different terrain. Although I'll relate to what I would say a sister city of Jerusalem, Mecca, to some extent. So this was my doctoral dissertation that I defended in Leiden University almost now 3 years ago, or more than 2 years ago, in which I was particularly looking at the circulation of Shafi'i madhab and its texts across the Indian Ocean. As many of you are familiar, or might be familiar, with the fact that Shafi'i School of Law is the most prominent school in the Indian Ocean littoral, from South Africa to Southeast Africa, or East Africa to South Asia, and coastal Southeast Asia. But historically, not many people have, or historiographically, not many people have analyzed, why and how this school got that much prominence, even though there have been some sort of explanations. But I'll stick to 16th century in this paper for a number of different reasons. As we all, or some of you working on 16th century must know that it's a century of significant ruptures in terms of politics, trade, culture, mobility, and also law, in which not only different large empires such as the Mughals, Safavids, and Ottomans come to power, but also very unprecedented ruptures in the population, environmental changes, all witnessed in 16th century. And it's also a century of revitalization of several pre-existing networks, particularly the Silk Road and also the Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, Atlantic routes, in which we see many new players and actors coming and creating vast changes. And these changes not only had impact in terms of trade alone, which was the major reason there was a revitalization, but it also, along with these changes, there were a lot of new mobilities of scholars, texts, ideas, schools, and multiplicities of ideas and things like that. Within the religious realm, whether it's Islamic or Christian religious realm, we see proliferation of religious networks, mystical or legal networks, and institutions, educational institutions, as well as mystical institutions, such as mosques, ribas, and madrasas. So what more interesting in this period, I would say, is like in 16th century, we see many old cities, this is a quotation from Stephen Blake's works on Shah Jahanabad, in which she says that very many old cities which were like or small towns in 15th or 14th centuries got new lives in terms of they began to become global cities. And some of these cities such as like Macau, Canton, Nagasaki, Goa, Batavia and Manila, as well as some Islamic cities also got new life in this period. And among those I would identify Mecca and Jerusalem as two sacred cities that got a new life vis-a-vis other sacred cities, maybe Banaras in South Asia or Lhasa for the Tibetan Buddhism, or Najaf, Karbala. These places which mostly got their new life in late 17th and early 18th century. Whereas Mecca and Jerusalem, both these cities attracted a lot of, what I would say, a nexus of pilgrims, scholars and exiles or immigrants from all over the world, making a lot of fluctuations in a number of different realms. And along with these, cities, what we see across the globe, but also particularly in my area, which is the Indian Ocean world, is that we have these, old texts and ideas getting new lives. So it's not just like very paradigm shifts happening in 16th century, but you have many old, this longue durée of the texts that have been circulating in the Islamic world, but getting a lot of new commentaries and traditions. So the commentarial traditions particularly being very important in 16th century in the new centers or new cities that emerged within the Islamic cities. Not necessarily new cities, but the old cities with new lives having more engagement with the new lives of the old texts. It will be more clear once I come to the concrete points. So within Indian Ocean world, which is my area, Mecca and Shafi'i School of Law are the two major nodal points that influence the circulation, new circulation or new life of this 16th century. So Indian Ocean is, as you might familiar, is a large realm of cross-cultural and trans-regional exchanges across the across the period. But in 16th century, it's again Indian Ocean got a very big shift in terms of its increased mobility of people, increased volume of trade, increased presence of different communities from all over the world. And within this broader framework, my central questions I have is like, how did the pre-modern textual traditions or pre-modern circulation of Islamic legal texts look like in the Indian Ocean and Eastern Mediterranean? These are not the questions that I address particularly in this paper, but what I have been exploring or what I did explore for my doctoral dissertation. And also, to what extent did legal texts play a role in shaping this maritime littoral, and why and how did the Shafi'i School of Law in particular appealed to a wider following around the Indian Ocean? And most importantly, how did peripheral Muslims, quote-unquote peripheral Muslims, respond to these larger changes, and how did their intellectual networks generate a non-Middle Eastern alternative discourse? And for this paper particularly, what are the major continuities and ruptures in the 16th century? The major reason why I put these questions are mainly because of these three major gaps in the historiography. One is that, sorry that I'm repeating some of my, some people like Judith listened to my presentation just last month. So sorry that I'm repeating some of my ideas, but still the broader gaps in the historiography is like the Islamic law in the classic or after the classical period is something that has been largely ignored. Although in the last 5-6 years there is a new trend to analyze and interpret the commentarial traditions. So which otherwise have been ignored in the historiography have something like doesn't have any originality. It's repetition. The commentaries are just repetitions of the old old original texts and things like that. And also the peripheries, quote unquote peripheries, South Asia and Southeast Asia, despite of having the largest Muslim population in the world, once you come to the history of Islamic law or historiography of Islam, these two subcontinents are always neglected, as if there was no Islam in these places before, let's say, 18th century, when the colonial empires or the Europeans came into this scenario. As you were referring to, Abou-El-Haj is the best example, but also Joseph Shahtan, all of these people encounter, let's say, India or Indonesia, Malay world from, say, 18th century onward. So this is something also that, so 16th century, again, would give a different picture for the existing narratives in the historiography. And another one is like Islam and its law in the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean studies. These two fields I wouldn't say much about Mediterranean because I'm not an authority or like an expert on the field, but in the Indian Ocean, whether it's Ken Chaudhary or even Goiten for Mediterranean, they all talk about law being at the center of, mercantile networks, but they don't really explain how and which law played a role in the, materialization of the trade, mobility of people across large borders. So this is also something whether it's, in Indian Ocean studies or other places, the role of law, particularly Islamic law, is not expounded as such. And another narrative or a rhetorical narrative in the historiography is that Shafi'i school, as I was mentioning at the very beginning, Shafi'i madhab is the most important school in the Indian Ocean world, which is also, I would say, a rhetoric because no one has really explored when and how and if at all this school, this madhab existed in the Indian Ocean before, let's say, before 16th century. So I do this exercise basically looking at one text, which is Minhaj al-Talibin, the first text listed at the top. So looking at the biography of this text and the ways in which that text traveled across large borders. This text was written in 13th century Damascus by Nawawi, and all the texts listed after are commentaries of that text. So Tuhfat al-Muhtaj, which is a commentary written in 16th century along with several other commentaries. And Fathul Mu'in is a super commentary, you can say, or an abridgment based on Tuhfat al-Muhtaj. And Nihaya is a commentary based on Fathul Mu'in. So it's a kind of, I'm coming into a chart which make, the genealogy of this text more clear in a minute. And there are also there are several other text school within the Shafi'i madhab, but I looked into one family of the Minhaj, I would say, and the ways in which this family enabled this trans-regional and period or trans-chronological mobility of Islamic law, particularly Shafi'i law. So this is how it looked like. So Minhaj is this text at the very bottom, and these are the ancestral texts that, or Minhaj itself claims to belong to a larger chronology or larger tradition, going back to the founder or eponymous founder of the school, Imam Shafi'i. The text is called I don't know whether the title itself comes from the text, but or interestingly, it's a mother text of the whole Shafi'i textual tradition. And Minhaj belongs to that long tradition. And then also Minhaj itself had its own descendants coming up to 19th century and 20th century and continues. So as I was saying about 16th century is the most important for the commentaries of the tradition, because you see Minhaj attracting a lot of commentaries in 16th century, kind of unprecedented surge in the number of commentaries that Minhaj attracted. And Fathul Mu'in, which is also, I'll come. So these two, there is a mistake, which is like Fatah al-Mu'in is not 15th century Cairo, it is 16th century Malabar, which itself attracted a lot of commentaries across the Indian Ocean world. So this is how, in a way, in a map, it would look like, with Minhaj There are 4 screens. I can point only to one screen, which itself I think doesn't work. All right. So, you can see the ways in which these texts are spread across a large terrain from Eastern Mediterranean to Southeast Asia. So, these 2 texts, Tuhfat al-Muhtaj and Fath al-Mu'in, are the most important texts for not only the Shafi'i tradition, but also for the 16th century. Both texts were written in 16th century, and Tuhfat al-Muhtaj by Ibn Hajar al-Haythami has attracted about 35 plus commentaries, starting in 16th century, going up to 19th and 20th century. And Ibn Hajar al-Haythami was a scholar born and brought up in Cairo or in the suburbs of Cairo, and then moved to Mecca when he realized that Mecca is going to be, or Mecca is or was becoming the center of Islamic learning in the 16th century. So, along with what I would say the decline of Cairo in early 16th century, immediately after the conquest of Sultan Selim I, many scholars migrated to many different parts, including some of whom were captured and taken by Selim to Istanbul. Many other scholars who were not lucky to be captured or to be taken to Istanbul. Okay, thank you. So many scholars who were not lucky enough to be, taken to Istanbul found new abodes such as Mecca, which was emerging as a new center of not only learning, Islamic learning, but also a center of migrations from all over the world. Mecca in 16th century became the center, or the center that united Islamic world in 16th century. Even though many scholars and believers tend to believe that Mecca always has been a very important city throughout the history, which wasn't. It became very important only in 16th century when it ceased to become or ceased to be only a seasonal city. Rather, it developed into a global city in which more permanent settlements from all over the world, from Habsburg Empire to Philippines and Manila and Malay world and China, coming and studying and being settling and forming their own community in the city in 16th century. So Ibn Hajar al-Haythami was one of the figures who stood at the forefront of the educational revival of the city. And until then, Mecca was not an important city for Islamic education. Scholars from the city used to migrate to other places, but from 16th century onward, we see scholars from many other places coming to the city, not only for its religious sacred purposes, but also particularly for educational purposes. So Ibn Hajar al-Haythami, in a way, Shafi'ized the city through his different ideological and juridical encounters with the Hanafi muftis and Hanafi qadis in the city, appointed by the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman rulers. And among many students who studied with Ibn Hajar from different parts of the world, and among these many students who came from different parts of the world, this figure, Al-Malaybari, Zainuddin Al-Malaybari, was one of those figures, came from Malabar in southwest India and studied with Ibn Hajar, arguably studied with Ibn Hajar, and wrote this text called Fath al-Mu'in, which became kind of I would say, a voice from the periphery within the Shafi'i tradition, where he not only criticized Ibn Hajar for many of, not only Ibn Hajar, but many scholars or Shafi'i scholars before him for their lack of attention to the, again, quote-unquote, peripheral Muslims. And he contextualized and argued for a, let's say, Malabari, or if not an Indian version of Shafi'i school through his text called Fath al-Mu'in, which itself was a commentary of a text that he himself has written called Qurrat al-Ain. So Qurrat al-Ain attracted this, he himself wrote an explanatory, more detailed text, Fath al-Mu'in, which became, as many scholars in Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as in the Shafi'i Peninsula, South Asia, would call it the manifesto. So in the interest of time, I'll just say that, Shafi'ism in the 16th century kind of attracted. So both these texts stood at the forefront of a larger network or larger mobility of scholars, and particularly Shafiism. So in the existing narratives, Hadrami Sayyids have been credited as the sole preachers of the school across the Indian Ocean, which is not at all true. Rather, it was part of a cosmopolitan network of Karimi merchants, Egyptians, Syrians, Persians. I can give solid evidences or explanations on each of these communities for being at the forefront of spreading a school, Shafi'i school, and also along with several Malays, Hindis, or larger South Asians, as well as Swahilis being at the vanguard of spreading the school. And one interesting thing or factor about the 16th century is that it is not a unidirectional journey of the, let's say, Arabo-Persians being the sole exporters of Shafi school or Islam into the quote-unquote peripheral regions. Rather, many scholars from the peripheral regions contributed significantly to the spread of the school. And Malabarist text is one example of this circulation. And also, Mecca itself began to be replicated, or metaphorically or allegorically replicated in different parts of the Indian Ocean. Not for their importance in terms of religion, they didn't have any religious importance, rather for their importance for educational or religious education. So you have these places such as Aceh in Southeast Asia, Ponnani, Makli, Hyderabad in South Asia, Hajro, Linzia city. All these places metaphorically identified with Mecca from late 16th century onward, connoting the educational revival Mecca had attracted by that time. And Middle Eastern students coming to these little Meccas and studying in these places. And also the other way around, where the peripheral texts and scholars as teachers and textbooks in the Islamic heartlands. And I'll just skip this part and I'll come back to this conclusion. So the post-classical evolution within Islamic law from Minhaj and Nihaya is something that needs to be explained further, instead of rejecting the whole post-classical tradition as stagnant. And the textual longue durée of the Shafi tradition, starting, let's say, with going up to Nihaya in 19th century, 9th to 19th century, in which 3 centuries witnessing major leaps, that is 13th century in which Minhaj was written, 16th century in which these 2 texts that I mentioned were written, and 19th century in which many more commentaries were written. And in 16th century, you see the Shafi school being, the predominant school in the Indian Ocean, thanks to the, different contributors or networks who were very important in the Indian Ocean or transoceanic networks. And then the multi-directional journeys in which peripheral Muslims actively participated. Thank you very much for your attention. Myth of Shafism is because Shafism didn't have, or supposedly, according in the narratives, Shafism is the only school that survived or existed in the Indian Ocean. Not survived, existed in the Indian Ocean. If you look at, let's say, Andre Wing's book or many other books, you see that Shafism from 7th century, which is again very anachronistic, to 11th century is being at the part of, at the heartland of, at the coast of Shafism, which is not true. Only in 16th century, Shafism get the importance or the predominance in the Indian Ocean. Before that, there were many other schools, what I would identify as the intermixed legal landscape, in which Malikism was a very important school, based on the narratives of Ibn Battuta, whether in Maldives or in even Malabar coast, many other places. And Hanafism, also very important across Southeast Asia. Also some parts of coastal South Asia. In 15th century, for example, Ma Huan, Cheng He's, the Chinese Admiral Cheng He's translator come interpreter, who extensively wrote about the presence of Hanafism in different, and also we have a lot of Chinese Malay chronicles which talk about the presence of the Hanafi mosques and establishments. And we see in 16th century many of these centers and rulers converting from quote-unquote converting from Hanafism to Shafiism. And that's when in 16th century we have this, Shafism getting more importance in the Indian Ocean literal because of the, the Shafi networks that many people actively contributed, like, all these people.
Thank you. Questions, please? We will take a bunch of questions first. Yeah.
That was my question, like what other madhabs existed there, because I was thinking about the pre-16th century, and so I was thinking about Gujarat and Bijapur and, even the Lodi Sultanate, because they are different. But you answered that question, but my follow-up question, whether it had, in India just, whether it had to do with empires, with the Mughals, that Shafism becomes, or the unification of the Indian Sultanate and empire and the Mazhab. That was my question. And I have a
Yeah, go ahead.
to,
Please continue.
Rifa'at as well. And I'm answering your curious question, why I said it. But it's a serious question. In terms of, you said, if I didn't misunderstand you, that Jerusalem in the 16th century is not an Arab city. It has nothing to do with, it's not Arab history. Is this what you said?
We'll answer afterwards. We're going to get the questions first.
I want to continue, because I was born and raised in another town that was for 150 years under Ottoman rule. But I would say it remained more Hungarian than it became Ottoman. We still presume it as part of the Ottoman Empire at the imperial level. But if you look at the local levels, we didn't have, in many of these municipalities, we didn't have qadis. It was the local pre-conquest municipality and the institutions.
Rifa'at will agree with you, by the way.
And so my question is, what is the difference between Jerusalem and those cities?
Okay, let's get some more questions, please. Yes. No, we're going to take the questions first, then you'll answer. No, 3, 4, yes. 3, 4 questions, then you get the chance.
Okay, I have a question. Oh, do I have to use the microphone? Okay, I have a question for Mahmood about the conceptualization of center and periphery in the wider sort of Islamic world in the 16th century. My question just is basically, my question is about the geographical conceptualization of center and periphery in the 16th century. Basically, is the idea of the Arabic-speaking world as an intellectual center for Islamic scholarship. Is that a modern conceptualization of a center? And is there kind of evidence in the contemporary texts that that's the case? Basically, that like the South Asian scholarship that might be happening in Arabic is somehow peripheral, and that there's a circulation between a periphery and a center. And I ask this as someone who's sort of very interested in Arabic knowledge production in South Asia. And, there were so many, I don't have to tell this to you, right? There are so many places that considered themselves as centers, right? Like, Sialkot or, Patna. Places that are historic centers of Arabic language, Islamic scholarly production. Did they consider themselves to be periphery in the 16th century? I have my own impression, but I'd be interested to hear from your perspective. And then my other question is, if in the Indian Ocean kind of Shafi'i legal ecumene, was there any bleeding of legal or customary practices between madhabs or across sectarian divides? And I'm just thinking of certain Shafi'i practices that maybe would have influenced, Bohri practices or something like this. Have you noticed any examples of that? And that's it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, this might be a little stretch from your presentation, but I was wondering whether there is any link between consumption and the spread of legal schools, especially is there any link between Shafi schools' liberal attitude to seafood and its spread to coastal communities because there is more food available for Shafis?
I don't understand the question.
The question is whether there is a link between Islamic legal schools and dietary rules in those legal schools. Because most coastal communities are Shafis and inland communities are Hanafis, whether that is accidental or is it related to consumption patterns?
Any other questions? Let me ask one question. There is, oh, please go ahead.
Is there any record of some type of political violence or anything demanding the Shafi school? Because it is unique in that it's so homogeneously present when there was a history of heterogeneity.
Okay, just one last question, because I don't think we have time to take a whole series. This is why we're taking them all. It's a fast comment, but at the same time, it's a question that follows. Because what we had here is two contrasting presentations. And it's interesting, a lot of the questions actually work here. One presentation talked at the micro level, talked about lived realities, talked about mahals, how people lived, while the other presented us the macro with the intellectual production, with the legal systems that were being produced. I'm thinking here in terms of work I've personally done. When we talk about the Shafi'is, what kind of Shafi'is are we talking about? By the time Shafi'ism reached the ground or reached the mahal, what was it? When you take the Maliki Madhab, for example, the Maliki Madhab, I'm not even going to say North Africa versus Egypt, I'm going to say Alexandria versus Sa'id, Upper Egypt, completely different. The application in courts, you'd think they're totally different systems. A small example, in Upper Egypt, they actually recognize the woman's wilayat al-ijbar for her children. That's non-existent in Alexandria, which was more Maghribi, because it was a place the Maghreba passed through. So when we say Shafi'ism replacing Hanafism, what are we talking about? And what does the legal system really become once it is applied at the level that Rifa'at was talking about? And this is the same question to you, Rifa'at, because you're talking about the applications of kafala at a very local system, but the kafil also, there must be a system. Did Hanafism really guide this whole system? Or there was no dialectical references involved there? Okay. And please, each one of you will get 5 minutes to answer all of these questions.
First of all, Gabor's question about 16th century Jerusalem. You know my work. I've done a critique of Arab historiography of Ottoman, and I'm surprised at your question. That you understood the criteria behind critiquing Arab scholarship, modern Arab scholarship, that ignores 500 years of history. And yet you come up with a question similar to an Arab ignoring Ottoman history. So how do you want me to answer your question? I have to situate, no matter what you say, okay, your motive for studying, irrespective of what you say. I have to situate, when you say this is my motive, I still have to situate it historically, so that I can rationally understand and then explain why, for you, in the 20th and 21st century, an Hungarian who's a nationalist studies Ottoman history like I am posing to Arab historians, Amira included, right? Why do they ignore 500 years of their history? Because they don't see it as their history. And to some extent, that also relates to your presentations, the first one, again. I mean, this is something I'm sharing with you because it's something I'm raising myself after 50 years of doing history. And it really is a question of what do we mean by culture? When we talk about Ottoman history, or Muslim history, also for you, what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything unless you're talking something shared. An experience that non-Muslims who are living under Muslim rule not only are tolerated, but actually participating in the creation of the culture. If you miss that, then you're being ahistorical. You're not being historical. If you refuse to consider that premise, because you're saying we're inhuman. I mean, you're claiming the Hungarians are inhuman because they were unaffected in participating in Ottoman history.
I'm not saying.
No, I know. I'm putting the premises to you behind your question about 16th.
The different levels of provincial history of an empire.
Yes.
So it's part of both the local and the imperial. And I want to differentiate because there are many layers of the provinces.
It's okay, you can study Ottoman history. It's fine.
Except if you look
Rifa'at,
at the provinces, I'm not trying to teach you anything you don't know. When you talk about the provinces, you have a Turkish governor in Jerusalem. So there's a presence there. We're not talking about the Gulf area with hardly any Ottoman presence, even though there was a presence. So the question becomes, for us in the 21st century, how do we look at that history? And are we being historical if we actually go along with the nationalists who say we have nothing to do with the Ottomans? So at a minimum, you have to assume that we are human beings, and therefore, like it or not, from our point of view in the 21st century, our ancestors actually participated in their history.
no,
And I hope this is what we're studying.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, in terms of Jerusalem, Shafi'in, I don't know where you conjured up this question, and it's meaningless to me because I don't see any differentiation here. In other words, it will not register in the courts. At least I didn't see any, and I worked with this material for about a year. Okay, so I covered at least 30 years of Ottoman history. The first 30 years, or 35 years of Ottoman history in Jerusalem covered by the Sijil. All right, I don't remember any hint even of an issue there. But maybe because the court is one madhab or the other, but that's anyway. So in terms of your question, I don't know how relevant, even if there was a difference, because it didn't register historically. So I can't, you're asking an unrealistic question for me in terms of the evidence. I don't have any evidence that would substantiate even you raising the question. So you see what
thank you, Rifa'at. Mahmood,
It's a lot of questions.
you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be brief. So on the question of the empires or the rulers having an importance in particularly South Asia, and you were asking about the Mughals specifically. We do see almost all the empires within South Asia having some sort of an official madhab to affiliate with. And in the case of Mughals, in 17th century, it becomes very clear when Aurangzeb, asks people to codify. They codify different fatwa, what he calls fatwas, but different rulings within the Hanafi tradition. But once we look at two hands or two hands of Mughal Empire, let's say Bengal and Gujarat. These two places, we do see that Shafi school had some sort of prominence until 15th, 16th century, but then once after the Mughal conquest of these regions, in which the Hanafism getting more importance. Whereas Shafism as such, once we look at, it doesn't, after 13th century, it kind of loses any political patronage in different parts. Even though in Southeast Asia, there are a lot of rulers support the school as such, but it doesn't get that much patronage, unlike similar to Hanafism gets at the Ottoman Empire or other places. So in the Mughal realm, there is some examples for the Hanafi school being supported by the ruling regimes, but simultaneously we also don't see much that itself having an impact. It's a very ambiguous, like for example, in the introduction of Islam to South Asia, or the conquest by the early rulers, both of them, like Mahmood Ghazni and Muhammad Ghori, both of them were Shafi'is, but the school as such in the later histories didn't have any impact as such. So it's something needs to be further explanation. And geographical categorization knows questions on peripheries, whether these figures understood themselves as peripheries. Of course not. They thought that, after a point, let's say in 17th century onward, we see many of them saying that, Arabs, they don't know anything about Islam. We are the true upholders of Islam, which is very evident, let's say, in the Hadith tradition. Also partly in the fiqh tradition, some of them saying that, the real learning of Islam or real education in Islam comes from these places, whereas Arabs do not practice. So the categorization that I followed, center periphery, is more sort of a scholarly construction that comes from the lack of addressing these places, which do not appear in many of the existing historiography of Islam or Islamic law particularly.
I'm being told to cut. So
sorry.
I'll give you a couple of more minutes.
Okay.
From
so
my
then
pocket.
I'll kick on seafood. Definitely, this is something that is very contentious, especially between the Hanafis and Shafis. In South Africa, for example, in Cape Town, 19th century, when Abu Bakr Effendi, sent by the Ottoman Sultan Abdul-Hamid, before him, was sent back from, or was kicked out from the region for opposing, seafood, particular seafood. And the same you would see in Jahangir's court. There is a big debate among the Hanafis and Shafis on the question of seafood particularly. So it's a very, controversial.